Hey, what's up there, dear Sulfurs? Welcome to the second video in my series on how your car's starting system works and how you can diagnose a no crank, no start issue with your car. If you haven't watched the first episode, I'll put a link to it right here on this side of the screen. And I recommend you watch that one first because the things I'm about to start, the procedures I'm about to start showing you will make a lot more sense then. And as you may remember from the first video, this is where we are, and now we're just gonna start testing our ignition switch and go from here. Alright, so before we go on to testing our ignition switch, you want to make sure your relay that you tested and you're sure it's good, that you put it back in its slot. Alright, so in order to gain access to our ignition switch, we need to, in this car, we need to remove this kick panel that goes down here. A lot of cars that the ignition switch is on the steering column, you need to remove this cover. And in order to test it, you don't need access to the switch itself, but rather the connector that goes to your switch. Now, if you're having intermittent starting problems and you suspect your ignition switch, something you can do that sometimes helps is to, especially if this switch is on your steering column, is to just use the tilt of the steering wheel, just to cause some vibration. Or if you can actually get this kick panel off, just grab the wires or tap the ignition switch itself. Sometimes that gets your car going. Furthermore, it also might, basically verify that you are having a problem with your ignition switch. Alright, so next you want to remove your key from the ignition lock cylinder for this test. And next you want to get your multimeter and put it on volts. And then we're going to look for 12 volts that should be supplied to this ignition lock switch at all times. Now I'm going to just use this test light, but it's a better idea to use a multimeter. And according to the wiring diagram for this car, this white wire is the one that supplies 12 volts for our ignition switch that goes to our trigger wire that comes out of this ignition switch. So we're just going to test this, and hopefully you guys can see there we got 12 volts here. Now on some cars, makes and models, you only have one wire that supplies voltage to this ignition switch. On this car, I believe we have three. Here's the second one, this red and white wire in addition to this white wire, and then there's another wire up top that's got 12 volts on it too. And I'm going to assume that each wire that has 12 volts, like this one, might be for the accessories. The other one might be for your ECU and other control modules. And then this white one is the one that's for the starter signal wire. But if you could have only one wire that has the 12 volts. Alright, next you want to look into your wiring diagram again and find the wire that's for your starter signal wire that comes out of your switch that carries the 12 volts from this white wire when the key's in the crank position to your starter post, to the trigger post on your starter, and in our case it's going to be this black and white wire. So next we put our test light on the black and white wire that's for the signal that comes out of our ignition switch once the key is in the crank position. And then we put our key in the ignition switch, and then we're going to attempt to crank the engine, and then if this switch is working properly, we should have 12 volts coming out of that wire. There we go. Alright, so if you get 12 volts coming out of here, it means that your ignition switch is doing its job and it's working properly. So next from there, if your car has an alarm, you need to check an alarm relay if it's in this circuit, and also the fuse. But this car doesn't have an alarm, therefore not an alarm relay. So what we're going to do next is to check for continuity from this wire, from our ignition switch to our neutral safety switch, right? The connector that connects to our neutral safety switch. And we're going to do that by checking for resistance, and if there is no resistance, it means that there's no breaks in this wire, and this wire is not damaged, and therefore that wire is not our problem. So we're going to get our multimeter, turn it on, put it on ohm settings, and I'm going to put it in this last setting where we're going to hear beep if there is no resistance in the circuit. And then we're going to remove this connector. Next I'm going to attach this wire to this black and white trigger wire on this side, like this. Alright, next we're going to locate our neutral safety switch, which in our case is going to be this guy. Then we're going to back probe the wire that comes from our ignition switch to our all the way to our neutral safety switch. And you can either back probe it or just remove this connector. And for me it was just easier to take that connector out and then attach my alligator clip to it. And once we attach that alligator clip to another test lead, we should have no resistance here. There we go. Alright, great. So we found out that we got no problem in the circuit from our ignition switch to our neutral safety switch. So next it's time to test our neutral safety switch, and we're going to do another resistance test. We're going to test the resistance between the two pins on the switch itself that are for the signal coming to the switch, and then the corresponding pin that allows the signal to pass if the switch is in the park or neutral position. Alright, so this is going to be hard to show you on this car because access is very limited, but here's a look at a neutral safety switch out of a Land Rover Discovery. Now I know this is a bad one, but basically you want to make sure you put your car in park or in neutral, and then you want to, from your wiring diagram, you want to find out again the wire that supplies the voltage from your ignition switch, and then you find the corresponding pin for that, and then you want to find the wire that supplies the voltage after it gets to your neutral safety switch, and from here to your starter relay. And then you want to hook up the two test leads to those two pins on the neutral safety switch, and you want to measure for resistance. And there should be no resistance if your car is in park or neutral. And basically the way this works is this is going to be attached to the side of your transmission by these two bolts like this, and then you're going to have a shaft coming out of your transmission here, and then your shifter cable is attached to the end of this shaft. And as you select different gears, this shifter cable turns in here, in turn turning this gear that's inside here. And when you turn that gear to whatever position you want your transmission to be in, that lines up different contacts that are going to be inside this neutral safety switch. And therefore, if you're in park, the contacts, the way they line up, are going to allow the voltage to pass through here and out the other wire and to your starter relay. Now if you're having intermittent problems, sometimes you can tap this neutral safety switch, and then sometimes that helps with the contacts to line up. Or other times, if you find that your neutral safety switch needs to be adjusted, or actually if you find that you're not getting voltage out of here when you're in park, then what I recommend before replacing this is to loosen these two bolts that hold it in, and these are made this way so that you can adjust this. So then try adjusting it one way or another, all the while having your test leads attached to the two pins on this. And then if you hear a beep, or if you see that you got no resistance, if you move this to the left or to the right, then that's going to mean that it just needed adjusting, and then you should be good to go. Alright, you guessed it. Next we're going to measure resistance from here, the wire that comes out of your neutral safety switch, all the way to our starter relay. Alright, on the relay side for this test, this is where we're going to be attaching one of our test leads. I won't actually do the test, I think you guys get the idea, but again, it's very important that you know exactly where to measure resistance from, because again, if you get this wrong and measure the resistance of a hot wire here, then you could run the risk of damaging your multimeter. So again, if you haven't already watched it, watch that video on how to test relays. Alright, so if you get continuity from here to our starter relay, then the last thing is to just check for ground for the corresponding pin for our starter relay, and then since this is a 4-pin relay, the remaining pin is going to be for the ground. Alright, that should cover all the different tests you need to do to figure out a problem on this side. Now if you do find that you got a problem on this side, again I suggest you watch that first video. One thing I did forget to cover in the first video was that especially if you're having intermittent starting problems, there's a very good chance you have excessive voltage drop on this side. It's either on the positive or your ground side of your starter. Now, for those of you who don't know what a voltage drop test is, again, I suggest you watch that first video. It's a pretty easy test. Basically, you find out how much voltage you're losing when you go from your battery terminal to the positive post of your starter. Same thing on your starter. How much ground voltage you're losing as a result of the connections from your starter to your engine and your engine to your chassis. And again, if you do find that you're having an intermittent problem or your starter is not cranking fast enough, you need to do this voltage drop test while you're trying to turn the key to the crank position, or in other words, trying to get the car started. That's when you'll see the correct number for your voltage drop. And maximum allowed on the positive side is 0.5 volt, and on the ground side is 0.2 volts. So really your ground needs to be in really good shape. It needs to have really good contacts. And if you do find out that you got excessive voltage drop on one of these circuits, you just move your test leads back until your voltage drop goes again below the threshold. And then you find out that, let's say you started your test lead from your battery post to this positive post on the starter, and then when you move back from the post itself to the nut that's holding it in, and then your voltage drop, let's say, goes from 6 volts to below 0.5 volt, then your contact between that nut and the post is probably, there's a lot of corrosion in there. That's why you're not getting a good enough contact. That's what you need to clean in order to get your voltage drop below the maximum allowed. And one last thing, as far as how you can bypass your ignition switch and your neutral safety switch, is basically you just need to identify the different wires. like on this car, since we have a couple of different 12 volt wires that go to the ignition switch, you need to find out each corresponding wire, like the 12 volt that goes to the accessory wire, you need to attach those two, and then the 12 volt that's for the on position that goes to all your different ignition, your modules. You need to attach those, and then you just need to touch this wire that's for your trigger switch to one of these 12 volts, and then that will get your car cranking, and since these are already energized, you'll start your engine. Now, as far as how you can bypass your neutral safety switch, basically, if you get a working ignition switch, you turn it to the on position, and then you do the trick where you jump these two wires out, because if your ignition switch is working and you can get it to the on position, it means you're supplying power to all the different modules that need power, and basically you're at this point, your car is only waiting for a signal from your crank, which will get that signal sent to your ECU when the engine is turning by your starter. And once you jump this, you get your starter going, that turns your engine, and then you get your engine starts. Again, if you decide to bypass your neutral safety switch or your clutch pedal position sensor, it's very important that you do this only in an emergency, whereas in, to get your car started, to drive to the auto parts store to replace them. Because if you keep doing this, you're just going to forget, your car is going to be in gear, you're going to bypass this, and then your car is going to start moving, and you could hurt yourself or someone else, and I'm going to assume most people don't want to do that. So if you found anything in this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more like it, and you may also want to consider checking out some of my other videos. I'll put it up on the screen as video links so you can just click on it. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time.